Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Always fun to be back.
Today we're tackling a part of the brain you might think you already know. The cerebellum.
Uh-oh. Sounds familiar.
You've all given us a ton of material on it.
Right.
And I have to admit, I was surprised by how much more there is to this little brain than just balance and coordination.
Yeah, it's often overshadowed by, well, I guess, the flashier parts of the brain.
Right.
But as we'll see, it's absolutely essential for a whole range of functions.
Okay.
Some of which might surprise you.
I'm ready to be surprised. Let's start with the basics.
Okay.
We all learned in school that the cerebellum is involved in balance and movement.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating to me is that for a long time, scientists thought it was a relatively silent area because stimulating it didn't produce any obvious sensations.
It's true. They could poke around in there electrically, and people wouldn't feel or do anything dramatically different. So for a while, it was kind of a mystery. But then researchers started to notice that removing the cerebellum, while not affecting conscious sensation, had huge consequences for movement.
It's like this hidden puppeteer controlling our movements without us even realizing it.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this a little further. What's going on structurally in the cerebellum?
Well, anatomically, the cerebellum is divided into 3 lobes: anterior, posterior, and flocculonodular.
Got it.
But to really understand what each part does, we need to look at its functional divisions: the vestibulocerebellum, spinocerebellum, and cerebrocerebellum.
Okay, 3 lobes, 3 functional divisions. It sounds pretty straightforward,
Right.
but I have a feeling it's going to get more complex.
Oh, you're right about that.
Right.
Each of those functional areas has its own set of connections to other parts of the brain and plays a specific role in motor control.
So it's like a well-organized team, each member with its own specialty.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm ready to meet the team. And I'm also curious about the structure of the cerebellum itself. I know it has these layers, almost like an onion. What's the deal with that?
Yes. The cerebellar cortex. Think of it as a 3-layered cake.
Okay.
You've got the molecular layer on the outside, then the Purkinje cell layer in the middle, and finally the granular layer at the bottom. Now that middle layer, the Purkinje cell layer, is where things get really fascinating.
Is it because of those amazing Purkinje cells? I've seen pictures of them, and they look like something out of a science fiction movie.
Oh, right.
With those massive branching dendrites.
They're quite a sight.
Yeah.
But more importantly, Purkinje cells are the only output from the cerebellar cortex.
Wow.
All the information processed in the cerebellum has to go through these cells.
Okay.
And they send their signals down to the deep cerebellar nuclei. We'll talk about in a bit. But here's the kicker. Purkinje cells are inhibitory, meaning they put the brakes on the activity of the deep nuclei.
So all that information funnels through these Purkinje cells, which then tell the deep nuclei to chill out.
Right.
I'm already seeing how this balance between different signals is going to be important.
Yeah. And those deep nuclei, they're the real power players. You've got 3 main ones: the fastigial nucleus, the interpositus nucleus, and the dentate nucleus. Unlike the inhibitory Purkinje cells, these nuclei send out excitatory signals. It's this constant push and pull between excitation and inhibition that allows for fine-tuned motor control.
It's like a finely tuned dance between these different cells, with the Purkinje cells saying slow down and the deep nuclei saying speed up.
Exactly. This back and forth is happening all the time.
Wow.
Making sure our movements are smooth, coordinated, and precise. Now, to understand how this whole system gets its information, we need to talk about the efferent fibers.
Oh, we bring on the information highways. I know there are 2 main types: climbing fibers and mossy fibers. What makes them different?
Climbing fibers are like the express train from the inferior olivary nucleus in the brainstem. Okay.
They go straight to the Purkinje cells, and each one wraps itself around a single Purkinje cell,
Wow.
like a vine, forming a really strong connection.
Okay.
When a climbing fiber fires, it creates a unique, long-lasting electrical burst in the Purkinje cell called a complex spike. We think these complex spikes are essential for the cerebellum to learn new motor skills and adapt to changes.
The climbing fibers are like personal trainers for the Purkinje cells, pushing them to learn and grow.
Exactly.
What about those mossy fibers? Where do they come from, and what kind of messages are they carrying?
Mossy fibers are like the information gatherers. They come from all over the brain.
Okay.
The cerebral cortex, the spinal cord, the brainstem,
Got it.
even the visual and auditory systems.
Wow.
They provide the cerebellum with a constant stream of information about the body's position, movements, and the world around it. Wow, it's like a giant sensor network feeding data into the cerebellum's control center. But how does the cerebellum make sense of all this information? How does it know what to do with it?
That's where things get really interesting. The cerebellum uses a system of afferents copy and efferents copy to compare what it planned to do with what actually happened.
Okay.
Imagine you decide to reach for a cup of coffee.
Okay.
Your brain sends out the command to move your arm, and at the same time sends a copy of that command, the efferents copy, to the cerebellum. Meanwhile, the cerebellum is also receiving information from your senses about how your arm is actually moving, the afferents copy.
So the cerebellum is constantly checking its work.
Right.
Comparing the intended movement with the actual movement. That's brilliant. But what's the point of all this comparing and contrasting?
It's all about error correction and learning.
Okay.
By comparing the efferents copy and the afferents copy, the cerebellum can detect any discrepancies between what it planned to do and what actually happened. If there's a mismatch, it can send signals to adjust the movement and make it more accurate next time.
So it's not just about controlling movement. It's about constantly refining and improving our movements.
Yeah.
Learning from our mistakes.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Okay, I'm ready to dive into some of the specific functions of the cerebellum.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with the vestibulocerebellum, which, as we mentioned earlier, is all about balance and posture. How does it actually work?
Well, imagine you're walking across a wobbly rope bridge.
Okay.
Your inner ear, specifically the vestibular system, is constantly sending signals to your brain about your body's position and movement in space.
Right.
Those signals go straight to the vestibulocerebellum, which uses that information to make adjustments to your posture and keep you balanced.
Okay, so the vestibulocerebellum is like our internal tightrope walker, constantly making sure we don't fall over. But what happens if something goes wrong in this area?
If the vestibulocerebellum is damaged, you might experience ataxia, which is a loss of coordination that can make you feel unsteady on your feet.
Oh.
You might also develop nystagmus, which is where your eyes make involuntary, jerky movements.
That sounds pretty disorienting.
Yeah.
It really highlights how crucial the cerebellum is for just basic things like standing and walking. What's next on our cerebellar adventure?
Let's talk about the stretch reflex, which is a fundamental mechanism for controlling muscle tone and posture. You remember those muscle spindles we learned about in biology class, right?
Vaguely.
Yeah.
They're those little sensors in our muscles that detect changes in muscle length, right?
Exactly. When a muscle is stretched, the muscle spindles send a signal to the spinal cord, which triggers a reflex contraction of that muscle. This is what's happening when doctor taps on your knee with that little hammer.
Ah, yes. The classic knee-jerk reflex. I always wonder why they do that. But where does the cerebellum fit into all of this?
Well, both the spinocerebellum and the cerebrocerebellum have a say in modulating the stretch reflex, but they have opposing effects. The spinocerebellum wants to dampen down the reflex, while the cerebrocerebellum wants to boost it.
So it's another one of those balancing acts we were talking about earlier. A bit of a push and pull between different parts of the cerebellum.
Exactly. And in most cases, the cerebrocerebellum's excitatory influence wins out. So the cerebellum actually facilitates the stretch reflex. This is really important, especially when we're carrying heavy loads.
Yeah.
The cerebellum helps to ensure that our muscles have the right amount of tone to support the weight without overstretching.
So the next time I'm struggling to lift a heavy suitcase, I'll know to thank my cerebellum for preventing me from collapsing. It's amazing how all these seemingly simple actions actually involve such complex coordination within the brain.
It really is. And speaking of complex actions, are you ready to delve into the cerebellum's role in voluntary movements?
I'm all ears. We've covered the basics. Now I'm ready to see how the cerebellum orchestrates those everyday movements we often take for granted.
All right, this is where things get really intricate.
Let's do it.
Okay, so as we discussed, the cerebellum is constantly receiving information about our body's position and the intended movements from other brain areas. One part of the cerebellum, the spinocerebellum, uses this information to act as a sort of servocomparator.
Servocomparator. That sounds pretty high-tech.
It might sound fancy, but it's a pretty straightforward concept. Think of it like this. You're driving a car, and you want to stay in your lane. You're constantly making small adjustments to the steering wheel to keep the car centered.
Right. Yeah, of course.
Well, the spinocerebellum is doing the same thing for our movements. It's constantly comparing the intended movement with the actual movement and making tiny adjustments to keep us on track.
Oh, so it's like The spinocerebellum is our personal driving instructor.
Yeah.
Making sure we stay on course.
Exactly. It's essential for those fine motor skills we use every day, from writing with a pen to hitting a tennis ball. But the spinocerebellum's role doesn't end there. Remember we talked about the stretch reflex and how the spinocerebellum wants to dampen it down?
Yeah, it's like the spinocerebellum is trying to keep things calm and controlled.
Precisely. And this damping function is crucial for preventing overshooting of movements.
Okay.
Imagine you're reaching for a glass of water. Without the spinocerebellum's braking mechanism, your hand might overshoot the glass and knock it over.
Oh, I can definitely picture that.
Yeah. So the spinocerebellum is like the brakes on our movements.
Okay.
Making sure we don't go too far. What happens if those brakes fail?
What happens?
Well, one possible outcome is something called an intention tremor. This is a type of tremor that only occurs when someone is trying to make a voluntary movement.
Interesting.
Their hand might shake uncontrollably as they try to reach for something.
Oh, gosh.
Making even simple tasks really difficult.
Yeah, I see how that could be a big problem for people.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
So, the spinocerebellum helps to keep our movements smooth and controlled.
Right.
What other tricks does it have up its sleeve?
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, it's also involved in controlling ballistic movements.
Ballistic movements.
Yeah, these are those super fast, almost automatic movements that happen too quickly for conscious control.
Okay.
Like typing on a keyboard or moving your eyes while reading.
Oh, okay. Wow, those movements are so quick.
Right.
I never even think about them. How does the cerebellum manage to keep up?
Well, for ballistic movements, the spinocerebellum basically sends out turn-on, turn-off signals to the muscles involved, ensuring that they contract and relax at just the right times to produce the desired movement.
So fast.
I know. It's like a perfectly timed choreography,
Right.
all happening in milliseconds.
So the spinocerebellum is involved in fine motor control,
Right.
preventing overshooting of movements,
Yeah.
and coordinating those lightning-fast ballistic movements. It really is a multitasking marvel.
It is, yeah.
But what about the other part of the cerebellum we mentioned earlier? The cerebrocerebellum. What's its role in all of this?
The cerebrocerebellum is like the mastermind behind planning and sequencing complex movements.
Okay.
Let's say you're writing your name.
Done.
This seemingly simple act actually involves a complex sequence of muscle contractions,
Yep.
each one perfectly timed and coordinated with the next. The cerebrocerebellum is responsible for ensuring that these movements flow smoothly and seamlessly from one to the next.
So if the spinocerebellum is the driving instructor, the cerebrocerebellum is the choreographer, making sure all the moves are graceful and perfectly timed.
That's a great analogy.
All right, good.
But the cerebrocerebellum's role goes beyond just planning movements. It's also involved in something truly remarkable, predicting future movements.
Predicting the future. How is that even possible?
It's not magic, although it might feel like it. The cerebrocerebellum is constantly receiving information from our senses about the world around us.
Right.
It integrates this information with what it knows about how the world works and our own body's capabilities to create an internal model of our surroundings.
Okay.
This model allows it to anticipate how our movements will affect our environment and to adjust our actions accordingly.
So it's like the cerebellum is running simulations in the background.
Right.
Figuring out what's going to happen next and preparing our bodies to respond.
Exactly. And this predictive ability isn't limited to movement.
Right.
The cerebrocerebellum also helps us to time events beyond movement.
Wow.
Like predicting the approach of an object or anticipating the next beat in a song.
It really is like having an internal GPS system guiding our actions and perceptions. This is all so incredible. But I'm also starting to wonder, what happens when things go wrong in the cerebellum? What are the consequences of cerebellar damage?
Well, unfortunately, damage to the cerebellum can lead to a variety of problems, and these typically show up on the same side of the body as the lesion. One of the most common symptoms is hypotonia, which is a decrease in muscle tone. This can make you feel weak and floppy, like a rag doll.
So instead of our muscles being at the ready, they're kind of slacking off.
You could say that, and this ties back to what we were discussing earlier about the stretch reflex.
Right.
When the cerebrocerebellum's excitatory influence is lost, the inhibitory effect of the spinocerebellum takes over, leading to decreased muscle tone.
Okay, so hypotonia is like the first domino to fall.
Right.
And it can lead to a whole cascade of other problems. What are some of the other symptoms of cerebellar damage?
Well, we talked about ataxia before, which is that loss of coordination and control over voluntary movements.
Yeah.
It can affect everything from walking and talking to eating and writing. People with ataxia might have trouble with balance. They might sway or stagger when they walk,
Right.
and their movements might appear jerky and uncoordinated.
So it's like their movements are no longer smooth and fluid. They're kind of all over the place.
That's a good way to put it. And remember those intention tremors we discussed. They're another common sign of cerebellar damage.
Yeah.
These tremors only happen when someone is trying to make a voluntary movement,
Right.
and they tend to get worse as the person gets closer to their target. It's like their hand is having a mini earthquake every time they try to reach for something.
Oh, gosh, that's awful.
Yeah.
Are there any other telltale signs that someone might have cerebellar damage?
There are a few others. Cerebellar nystagmus, for example, is a condition where the eyes make involuntary rhythmic movements, often from side to side or up and down. This can make it difficult to focus on objects, and it can even cause dizziness and nausea.
So it's like the eyes are having trouble staying still.
Yeah.
They're constantly darting around.
Exactly. Another interesting phenomenon is called the rebound phenomenon,
Okay.
which highlights the loss of the cerebellum's braking mechanism.
Right.
If you ask someone with cerebellar damage to hold their arm out and you push down on it, their arm might fly upward when you release the pressure, as if they can't control the rebound.
So their arm is like a spring that's been wound up too tight? And what about those terms we touched on earlier, dysmetria and idiodochikinesia?
Yes. Dysmetria is the inability to judge the distance or range of a movement, leading to overshooting or undershooting the target. Idiodochikinesia is the inability to perform rapid alternating movements,
Right.
like quickly turning your hand palm up and then palm down. These problems are all related to the cerebellum's impaired timing and coordination functions.
Okay, so we've got hypotonia, ataxia, intention tremors, nystagmus, rebound phenomenon, dysmetria, and idiodochikinesia. That's quite a list of potential problems. And it sounds like they could have a significant impact on a person's ability to perform everyday tasks.
You're absolutely right. Even simple things like walking, talking, and eating can become incredibly difficult for people with cerebellar damage. And unfortunately, the cerebellum doesn't have a lot of regenerative capacity.
Oh, no.
So these problems can be long-lasting and even permanent.
That's really disheartening to hear. But before we get too gloomy, can we talk a little bit more about how cerebellar damage affects speech?
Sure.
I know you mentioned the term dysarthria earlier. What exactly does that mean?
Dysarthria is a speech disorder that can be caused by damage to various parts of the brain, including the cerebellum.
Okay.
It's characterized by slurred, slow, or choppy speech, making it difficult for others to understand what the person is saying. This happens because the cerebellum plays a crucial role in coordinating the muscles we use for speech,
Right,
like
yeah.
those in the tongue, lips, and jaw.
Yeah.
When it's damaged, those muscles don't work together smoothly, leading to distorted speech.
So it's like the orchestra's speech is missing its conductor, resulting in a jumbled symphony of sounds.
Now, to wrap up our discussion of cerebellar lesions, I want to touch on the concept of ataxia again. Remember how we talked about sensory ataxia and motor ataxia? It's important to distinguish between these two because they have different causes and different symptoms.
Right. Sensory ataxia is caused by damage to the sensory pathways that carry information about the body's position in the brain, while motor ataxia is caused by damage to the cerebellum or other parts of the motor system. But how can you tell the difference between the two?
One clue is that people with sensory ataxia often have difficulty walking in the dark or with their eyes closed because they rely heavily on visual cues to compensate for their lack of sensory feedback.
Oh, okay.
They might also have a positive Romberg sign, which means they sway or lose their balance when they stand with their feet together and their eyes closed.
So sensory ataxia is like trying to walk through a room blindfolded. You're stumbling around because you don't have that sense of where your body is in space.
Exactly. Now, people with motor ataxia, on the other hand, usually don't have a positive Romberg sign, and their walk is often described as drunken or staggering because they have trouble coordinating their movements, even with their eyes open.
Okay.
They might also have those other cerebellar signs we discussed, like intention tremors and nystagmus.
So motor ataxia is like trying to walk a straight line after having one too many drinks. Your movements are uncoordinated, even though you can see where you're going.
A perfect analogy. And with that, I think we've covered the main points about cerebellar lesions. It's a complex topic, but hopefully you now have a better understanding of how damage to this often overlooked part of the brain can have such a profound impact on our lives.
Absolutely. It's amazing how much we've learned about the cerebellum.
Right.
And yet it still feels like we've only scratched the surface. It truly is a fascinating and essential part of the brain.
I agree.
Yeah, it's incredible to think that we started this deep dive thinking about the cerebellum as primarily responsible for balance and coordination.
Right.
But we've uncovered so much more. It's involved in fine-tuning movements, predicting future actions, and even like helping us time events in the world around us.
It's really a testament to the complexity of the brain and how even those parts that don't get as much attention play such crucial roles in our daily lives.
I'm particularly fascinated by the idea that the cerebellum is constantly learning and adapting.
Yeah, me too.
It's not just like a static control center.
Right.
It's actually changing and refining its responses based on our experiences.
That's right. Think of it like a musician practicing an instrument. With every repetition, the cerebellum gets better at coordinating the movements and predicting the sounds until the performance becomes effortless and seamless.
And this learning process isn't limited to just physical skills. The cerebellum also seems to play a role in, like, learning new cognitive tasks.
Right.
And even in social interactions.
Yeah, that's an area of ongoing research, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the cerebellum's influence extends far beyond just motor control.
So it's more than just a little brain.
Uh-huh.
It's a multifaceted and essential part of who we are.
Absolutely. It's involved in so many aspects of our lives, from the way we move to the way we think and interact with the world.
I think as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a sense of awe and wonder at the incredible complexity and power of this often overlooked part of the brain.
It is amazing. And it's a reminder that there's still so much we don't know about the brain.
Right.
And that every new discovery opens up even more fascinating questions.
So before we say goodbye, I want to leave you all with a thought to ponder.
Okay.
We've talked about all the amazing things the cerebellum does, but what about those moments when things don't go quite as planned?
Yeah.
Those times when we trip, stumble, or say the wrong thing. Could those be glimpses into the cerebellum's constant struggle to keep up with the demands of our complex lives?
That's a great question to consider, and perhaps a reminder to be a little kinder to ourselves.
Yeah.
And to appreciate the incredible work our cerebellum is doing every moment of every day, even when it's not perfect.
Well, thank you for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of the cerebellum. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive and that you'll continue to explore the wonders of the human brain.
It was my pleasure. And until next time, keep those brains buzzing and remember there's always more to discover.